including turkey burgers now costing $15. I'm sure you're aware of these changes. So let me talk a little bit about where we're going tonight. First of all, when I joined the Peace Corps, I was a Spanish speaker, and I wanted to go to Latin America. I had hoped that Peace Corps would send me somewhere like Honduras or Guatemala, and the whole idea is that I would go and make my Spanish even better. I had volunteered with United Farm Workers on the Texas-Mexico border, and I was, as a 22-year-old, was very committed to the idea of working on a farm in Latin America and learning Spanish, and I joined the Peace Corps, and the Peace Corps said, great, your Spanish ability, that's fantastic. We'd like you to go to Vladivostok. And I said, they don't speak Spanish there. And they said, oh, okay, how about Mongolia? And I said, no. And they said, Kiribati, which I had to look up. That's a South Pacific island nation. I said, no. And then it was Turkmenistan. And then they offered Chad. And we got to about the 7th country. And I said, absolutely not. I want to go to a Spanish-speaking country. And they said, it's not Club Med, it's the Peace Corps. You don't get to choose. And I said, well, thanks, but no thanks. And they called back 2 days later and said, last offer. China. And I said, you've got to be kidding me. I don't speak Chinese. I can't even use chopsticks. And they said, you leave in 3 weeks. So I gave my cat away, I sold my car, I broke my lease, and I was on an airplane. And that was 20 years ago this summer. I was the first volunteer in this little town down here called Neijiang, which is just north of the Yangtze River. This is down in Sichuan province in the far southwest. At the time I moved there, it was the heroin capital of southwest China. Which was an interesting place to be as the only foreigner at this campus and in this town working. Not only because I was very isolated and I had, this was before computers, this was before the internet, obviously, or cell phones even. So I had to learn Chinese. It was a good way to become fluent rather quickly. But the other thing that was interesting is the city was going through such a massive turnover because of the drug trade that was being broken up, because of new infrastructure coming in, a new rail line, a new highway. Plus, the students I taught, they were about my age. They were age 22, 23. They were the first generation that were not going into state-assigned jobs. So just as I was quite lost in mid-90s China about how to find a job after college, how to get a driver's license, how to find an apartment, my students were just as lost. And so I sort of grew up with that generation of Chinese people starting in the mid-90s. Out of 97, I moved up here to Beijing. This is the Great Wall, by the way. And tonight I'm going to talk about the Northeast. The Chinese say that their country resembles the outline of a chicken, which would make the Northeast its head. I always ask, why is Taiwan here? And they say, because Taiwan's the egg that the chicken is protecting. So we're going to go up here to the Northeast. A quick detour, though. I did live in Beijing for almost a decade after Peace Corps. I moved there. I was teaching, and then I started doing journalism there. I was a stringer for Time Magazine, and I started doing a lot of reporting for other papers. But the one story that I couldn't get enough reporting on was the destruction of the old city. I think it's time to write a book when the book you want to read does not exist. I wanted to know what it was like to live in these old lanes that were vanishing. If you've been to Beijing, you know these are the hutong. Yeah. And I couldn't find a book that someone had written before. So I thought, okay, I'm going to set off and do this. And so in 2005, I moved into this house. This is my bike. This is my roof that needs weeding. I moved in, this is Dashalar, Dajalan officially. It's the neighborhood just on the southwest corner of Tiananmen Square. It's the oldest neighborhood in Beijing, has a 600-year-old history. And when you're a tourist and you pass through these lanes, they're quite beautiful in a sort of romantic decay sort of way, the way Havana can be beautiful when you pass through it. But poverty isn't picturesque, as I found out. Living there, this was not a grand old courtyard home. This had been subdivided over the decades and really ill-kept. This is the street entrance here. You come back. The house had been divided into 4 separate courtyards. There's a door here, a door here, a door here. And then in the back, in the furthest back, is my house. This was once the servants' quarters for this home. This is my room here. I'm standing in it. There are 3 people that live in this room. There's one person who lives here. There's an elderly woman who lives here. And I'm standing in my neighbor's here. There's 3 people living in a single room here. They called me Big Landlord because I had 2 rooms. There's no toilet, there's no heat, there's no running water. We had a cold water tap that a trickle would come out of. This is a propane burner in here, but this is very 21st century. I had broadband internet. I had really fast internet here. They ran the cable in and dropped it down. I'm a big Oakland A's fan, so I could listen to my baseball in the summertime live. The hardest part of living here was the toilet. This was a 5-minute walk down the lane, and advertising had saturated Beijing in the run-up to the Olympics that it got to the point where even when I went into this toilet, which had no dividers between the squatting stalls, when I would squat down to go to the bathroom, I'd be facing this guy, and he's advertising the Hospital for Anus and Intestine Disease. These are the symptoms you could be checking yourself for as you're doing your business. I always wondered who his agent is. But I show this here to illustrate something too. One reason I love reporting from China and speaking Chinese, frankly, is how frank it is. They had to change their name in the run-up to the Olympics to the Proctology Hospital, but I like the old way of saying things, the very direct translation instead. This is the last slide I'll show of Beijing. This is the main street in my neighborhood. I don't know what Keystone is. Is that good or bad? It sounds secretive. Okay, good. So he's going to self-destruct. So this is the main street in our neighborhood. Dr. Lar, this neighborhood I was reporting from for these 3 years, for the last days of Beijing, is 1 square mile. Vatican City is 1 square mile. Vatican City has 700 people living in it. This 1 square mile has 57,000 people living in it. It's incredibly dense, and the challenge living here was, finding stories and representative stories, frankly, that would both be honest about what was happening in the neighborhood and the history of the place and the lives who live there, but also resonate with Western readers. This is my sort of challenge as a writer, is I'm straddling 2 cultures here, because I'm both writing for an American audience, a Western audience, who I need to have characters that live and breathe on the page and suspense that makes you want to keep turning the page. But now my work is also translated into Chinese, and so I have a Chinese audience as well, which is a very sort of uncomfortable line to straddle. This book did it. I don't know if Manchuria will do that, and I'll talk about that in a second. So what made me leave this to go up to the Northeast on a farm? It's these kids right here, actually, where this idea was launched. I taught the same kids, grade 4, grade 5, grade 6. I followed them as they aged. These are my students down here. These kids are grade 4. They're wearing the official school safety hat you have to wear that shows cars where you are. They're wearing their Young Pioneer kerchiefs. They're wearing the school uniform. These girls are grade 6. They've taken off the hat, the red Pioneer scarf, and the school uniform. Why? Because they have to go back to their home village. In this neighborhood of 57,000 people, about half the people who live there are quote-unquote native Beijingers. The other half are migrants who have come in from the outside provinces to work. In Beijing and in Chinese cities right now, we often hear that China's urbanizing, that the majority of the population lives in cities. That may be true technically, but really, these kids and their parents and people who come from the countryside into cities are really second-class citizens. They're quite marginalized. They're not full urbanites in that they don't have the same access to state-run hospital, healthcare, that sort of thing, and they do not have access to Beijing or larger city middle schools or high schools. So they can go to elementary school all the way up to grade 6, but when it comes time to sit for the middle school entrance exam, they have to take that back in their home village and be sent back often to their grandparents and go to school in the village. So watching the half of my student class leave got me thinking again, like, well, what is going on in the countryside? And where is the book about how farmers are living and the changes that are going on there? So I moved from here to this. An area of 20 square miles and only 1,500 people. The demographics here kind of make me smile. It's 500 women, 500 men, and 500 children. Literally a one-child policy, right? Everybody has a kid. There's some elderly and other people, scattered in there, but it really is like 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. This is the road leading out here. I want to just show you a map quickly where we're going. This is Beijing. The Great Wall would run just a bit north of there. The Great Wall was always historically the de facto border that you would pass through and go to the northeast. And when you go to the Great Wall, or if some of you maybe have been to the first pass under heaven, the Great Wall steps down into the Yellow Sea here, the Bullhead Gulf. And when you go to that part of the Great Wall, it's been reconstructed. It's really beautiful for tourists, right? But at the end of that, maybe from here to the back windows of the bookstore, there's a big gray cinder wall that blocks off the reconstructed portion of the Great Wall from what lies behind it. And in the middle of that wall is a door, just like the door right here. There's a normal apartment-sized door, right? And if you lean really hard on that and budge it open, the door opens, and then you see the unreconstructed Great Wall with the bushes and the trees growing on it and crumbling and so forth. And that to me was a perfect metaphor for entry into the Northeast, because it's an area that few people write about, few people visit, unless they're going to, say, a winter carnival or something like that. And for me as a writer, this was really fertile territory to explore. It's about the size of Germany and France combined geographically. Population-wise, it's about the same as Germany and France combined, about 110 million people. You see here we're bordering Mongolia, Russia, Vladivostok, a throwback to my Peace Corps offer, and North Korea. I went from Beijing 600 miles northeast, just north of Jilin City right here on the Songhua River. So that 600 miles is about the same as going from Washington, D.C., straight up the northeast into central Maine. And that's kind of the same latitude as well. I don't know in American history if New England, that term, ever fell out of favor. Like in the early 1800s, if people in Massachusetts and New Hampshire said, don't call it New England anymore, we won the revolution, we don't like that. Now it's come back in vogue. Manchuria fell out of favor in the 1950s after the Communist Party won the Chinese Civil War and finally brought the Northeast under, into China whole administratively. The Soviets pulled out in 1955. And since the 50s, you don't hear the word Manchuria so much anymore, and certainly not in Chinese. In Chinese, it's Dongbei. It rhymes with wrong way, which I like. That's a lot of people think about it, you're going the wrong way. And that just means the Northeast. They just call it the Northeast. But the word Manchuria long predates the events of the 20th century. It goes back to the 18th century. Although it sort of has a connotation these days of Manchukuo, which was the Japanese puppet state that existed here from 1931 to 1945. Even the Communist Party used Manchuria in its correspondence and things like that in the 1920s and 1930s. So some people, oftentimes Western journalists ask, like, is that a sensitive word? Whereas Chinese journalists are like, we're really glad you're using that word again. We haven't heard that for a long time. So that's where we're going. My plan, frankly, was to do a sort of Good Earth with beer sort of book. I wanted to revisit the Chinese countryside much the way Pearl Buck and her husband, John Losing Buck, did their farm surveys of the 1920s. John Losing Buck founded China's first agricultural economics department. He and Pearl, his wife, would go out into the countryside in central China and they would produce these massive volumes of farm surveys. He would go out and look at farm implements and crop rotation and seed yield and all those things. Whereas Pearl would sit in the homes with the women and she would ask the women, what songs do you sing to your children? What food do you cook at night? Where do you go shopping? Do you know any good jokes? And so when you read these farm economy reports that John Losing Buck wrote in the 1920s, they're really dull, awfully dull. There are a lot of statistical tables, but salted in between those tables is all this lore that Pearl Buck collected and recorded and passed down. She wrote The Good Earth 5 months, or in 5 months, I should say, after doing that research. And in fact, many Chinese intellectuals these days think Pearl Buck and her husband should be classified as Chinese literature because Chinese intellectuals don't write about the farm, they write about the cities. So initially my idea was to move to this village and really just do what Pearl Buck did, just collect lore. I wanted to teach in the school again. These are my students, my elementary school students. They're playing basketball out on the snow. You see this village, it's not a rundown backward place. This is a brand new school building here, 3 stories, new basketball hoops. My wife and her mother actually grew up in this village. My wife went on to Beijing to go to university. She came to Berkeley and graduated law school. But one thing that drew me to this particular village named Wasteland is because I had extended family there. And again, to do a more personal book, I wanted to collect my family stories as well. The building that my wife and her mom went to is over here as a coal shed now, where they keep the coal for heating. So part of my original research was, again, just look at the village, look at family lore, look at what's going on in the countryside, and also talk to nut jobs like Mr. Meng, because Mr. Meng reminds me a lot of places that you see in Northern California sometimes, these wide open spaces where you meet these eccentric characters. It's hard to find eccentric characters in places like Beijing where everybody's right up on top of one another. But Mr. Meng gained national renown in China for being the first Chinese to be visited by aliens. And here he is on the red flag logging commune. At one point, Manchuria had forests that were so thick that when you read journals of people who traveled there, it's like Daniel Boone hacking through Kentucky. They would go 9 days, in the trees without seeing the sun. But his logging commune has gone bust because so much of it has been cut down. He was unemployed. One night he saw a bright flash of light on this mountain. He thought, interesting, what was that? Went to bed that night, found himself levitating over the bed, passed through the wall, brought up to a spaceship, and then an alien made love to him. And I said to him, did you tell your wife? And he said, oh no. But he told the newspaper, which I thought was genius, and he started telling television stations to the point where he started touring the country to Chinese UFO conventions, talking about his story. Japanese tourists visited here and brought him television sets. A Malaysian businessman came and brought him a cow. He didn't know what he was going to do with a cow out here. But to me, he was a sort of example of the self-invention that you need in modern China, or in any remote place, to get out of places like this. And he, as I followed him over the years, was offered a job at a university and got his 8-year-old son off the farm and into the affiliated middle school on the college campus. Now when you talk to him, he's sort of embarrassed about it. Like, it's like interviewing a former adult film star. He's like, oh no, that was somebody else. He just looks like me. But he did really well with this story, and he's even added wrinkles to it in the future. Now he'll tell people that the aliens came back and told him that, good news, in 60 years you're going to be a father. And he said, what? And he said, yes, on 60 years on a distant planet, an alien will give birth to a peasant, which I love. He's introduced class consciousness to interstellar relations. I asked him to draw the alien for me. He drew a series of rubber tires that were narrow on top and wider in the middle with big googly eyes. And one day after I visited him, I was driving out of the valley and I saw a billboard, the only billboard for miles around, which was Michelin tires.
Yeah.
Genius. So to my wife, Mr. Mung is an example. He's a practitioner of the great northeastern art of bullshitting. So the notion was, again, that the neighborhood I lived in Beijing was so dense, so overpopulated, that I wanted space, and instead of looking at a neighborhood, I was going to look at a field and just try to track the history of this one plot of land. In the States, if you're raising rice or corn, to be economically viable, you need about 2,000 to 3,000 acres to make, even to break even. In China, the average farm plot is 1.5 acres. It's about the size of an American football field. And this is my wife's extended family. This is their plot here. That's what it looks like in winter. This is at thaw. This is as the rice is coming in early summer. This is as the rice is the grains in ear here in late summer, and now we're at harvest. This area is interesting. Another thing, I wasn't really expecting this when I got there, but this area only cultivates rice, and compared to other rice-growing regions of China, they're quite prosperous. And the reason is that the Northeast only grows 12% of all of China's rice, but it grows half of the short, sticky variety that we eat in sushi. You can picture that, right? Versus the long grain sort of jasmine style. And in Wasteland, this village, they started growing organically a decade ago. They were among the first villages in China to do that. Food safety is an enormous issue in China right now, as I'm sure you know. And so, whereas the average price of rice has doubled anyway in the last 6 years, the product that they grow here in Wasteland has tripled. The average Chinese farmer makes about $1,500 a year. In Wasteland, the farmers make close to $2,500 a year. They're almost approaching the per capita income of urbanites in China. They do quite well for themselves. The fields were off. Rice was actually first brought to this region by Korean settlers in the 1910s and 1920s, and there still are Korean villages around this area, including a village over here filled with North Korean refugees who have come over the border illegally and are living there and still working in the fields here. Now the village is named Wasteland, but it looks nothing like a wasteland, to me anyway. It reminds me a lot, actually, if you keep going straight north a little bit around Jack London State Park in the Valley of the Moon. It's this flat, fertile floodplain off the Salma River. The soil is so rich that if you sink your hand into it, it feels like wet coffee grounds. And then the land, these paddies are all flat, and they stretch out to these foothills here. So this is Wasteland. Over here is a place called Mudtown. Over here is a place called the Dunes. This is Lonely Outpost, and this is a town named Zhang Smelly Ditch. And although it took me a while to date the history of the village, it goes back to 1722. The names were harder to sort out, how these places got their names. And finally, a local historian explained to me, people in the past didn't want other migrants to come here. They wanted bandits to pass by. They gave them very undesirable names, the theory goes, so that people would pass by. And again, this is 1722 this area was founded. And the cultivation of rice in this area really began in the early 20th century. So if you've been to China, you know you're often hit right away with 5,000 years of history, 5,000 years of history. China has 5,000 years of history. But the region I'm living in and writing about in this book, really the recorded history is about 400 years. That's Romeo and Juliet, that was written in 1595. Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620. So we're within the realm in this book of these 400 years of what my American mind, anyway, can hold in one place and narrate. This is the house I lived in. Here's my onions. Corn's coming in. Grape trellis here. Our outhouse is back here. Again, an outhouse, but I have super fast broadband internet that came and ran the cable where I dropped it right in. 21st century China, right? If I told you there was a Porsche SUV parked on the street outside, you'd believe me, and it's true, there was. I shared the house. This is my half here. Mr. Guan, an ethnic Manchu man, a fisherman, lived in the other half of the house. He was my roommate while I was there. When you walked inside my room, this is looking at an autumn, here's our volunteer corn growing along the ridge. When you stepped inside, only this little tiny alcove when you walked in was on the ground. The rest of the house was a typical northeastern Chinese home in that it was dominated by the kang, they call it, this brick bed. And you can see the burn marks here on my linoleum. I had to keep sealing my kang, but it's a brick platform, and on the outside of the window over here is a vent, and you stuff that vent with dried rice chaff and light it on fire, and it smolders. So in wintertime, the temperatures would often be around -18 up here in Fahrenheit, but I'd be in the house in shorts and a t-shirt because you're laying on top of a fire, essentially. And after a while, you start to smell like baked bread, which was quite lovely. But I also liked when I came home, I was getting up on stage. I was doing my notes at night on that stage. This is the one road in town, Red Flag Road. When I moved there, it was a single lane road. And again, I went there originally thinking I'm going to do my wife's family history, lore, teach in the school, and just observe the seasons changing. But that first summer, this started happening to the road. Dump trucks came, dumped these enormous stones. These men are going to break the stones by hand and double the width of the road. This took them about 3 weeks to do an entire stretch of road. And when it was finished, it looked like this, including Wasteland's first lawn here, where they even put a stripe of grass in, which really ticked off Auntie Yi. She's one of the characters in the book. She grew up in this village. She remembers Japanese occupation. She went to school under the Japanese. She can still sing the Manchukuo anthem in Japanese. She can still count in Japanese because her knuckles were wrapped all the time if she didn't speak Japanese in school. But she is a communist cadre. She is one of the village officials, or long was, until she had to retire at age 55, which is mandatory retirement age for women in China. And she is representative in the book of hating the changes that are happening in Wasteland because this road was not built by the government. This road and these new street lights, solar powered, were built by the company who's advertising on the light poles here. It's called Eastern Fortune Rice, and it's an agribusiness. China has a trend that sort of, Wasteland was one of these pilot areas where it started, but it's starting to accelerate now, where China wants to start collectivizing its family-held farms and scaling up. So the American census, by the way, we stopped counting farmers in 1993 because farmers in America have become statistically insignificant. Less than 9% of farms in America grow the vast majority of our food with these enormous farms. China is promoting the same thing through companies like Eastern Fortune Rice. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One is Chinese farmland is decreasing. An area the size of New York State has been plowed under and urbanized, turned into city property. Soil pollution and environmental pollution is acute. An area the size of the state of Maryland has been deemed unfarmable because it's so contaminated. So you have those two issues. You have a pressure of land, and you want better, efficient methods of farming. And the other issue is that kids don't farm in China, or seldom farm. I grew up in Minnesota. We had 4-H club. The state fair was a very big deal. It was not a weird thing to be from. Well, you guys know, you're in Northern California. You know what it's like up here. It's the same thing south of Chico, where the Rice Valley is. It's okay to be a farmer when you're a kid. You're out in the fields. In China, no way. In Wasteland, these parents did not want their child in the fields. They wanted their child in school studying. Of course, after school, the kids would often sit and play video games or listen to Lady Gaga songs. But in theory, they weren't working the fields. At least they were going to move away and do something else. And so the average farmer in Wasteland, he or she is age 70. And this is another real issue with China right now of saying, look, we have an entire population that doesn't want to work the fields anymore. So one solution of this is we let companies like Eastern Fortune Rice come in. They use mechanized farming, they use planters and harvesters and so forth and hired labor. And that way this younger population will shift off the farm so we can still produce the same amount as before. Auntie Yi hated this. And throughout the book, she is the staunch advocate of, we've been a socialist economy for the last 50 years. It's worked for family like me. It's worked for the village. We're quite prosperous. Why are you changing? It's a sellout. Now, my backyard started to look like this after the first winter. And that, by summertime, became these. So another part of this transition in places like Wasteland is, as I said, China has these very high urbanization targets. And right now cities are full. And China wants to stop the flow of rural people coming into the cities for those very reasons, like I was saying. You can only go to school until grade 6, you're a strain on social services. So the other move right now is to push the city out to the countryside. So there's two sides of this. One's really good actually, in that cities are simply making their borders larger and larger. So places like Wasteland are now enveloped into the city. That's good for the kids who live out here because that means city teachers are being assigned to come out and work in this new school they've built. That's a good thing. The bad thing about it, though, is that for farmers such as Sanjo, he's another character in the book, who has a single-story home with a nice garden out front that he uses for his own food and to sell in the market, with a chicken coop for his own eggs and eggs to sell in the market. He doesn't want to give up this single-story home and move into those apartments. But the state government, through companies like Eastern Fortune, are saying, no, this is a waste of land. For you to have a single-story home with this vast yard in front of it is inefficient. We should plow under your house, plant rice there instead, it'll yield more money. You live in the apartment, that's much more efficient. So Sanjo is an example in the book. He's a character that I follow throughout as well, who's lived here his entire life, has been through 50 years of economic experiments, including communes, who's very happy now to finally grow his own crop, free of taxes, because China abolished all taxes on farmers in 2006, free of mandatory procurement from the state. The state will not take your grain anymore. He can sell freely on the market. He does not want to move out of his house. He does not want to give up his crop to this agribusiness company. The problem in China, is that once the state gets an idea, people usually have to fall in line. Now, this is President Hu Jintao. This is the biggest billboard in Wasteland. He visited the village in 2007. Usually when a Chinese leader comes to a village, he or she puts on Wellingtons and a Zhongshan suit, a Mao suit, and goes out in the muck of the fields and takes pictures with the peasantry to show that they're one and the same. Not so when Hu Jintao visited Wasteland. He kept his business suit on. Here he is with the manager of Eastern Fortune Rice. He did not go into the fields. He went to the Eastern Fortune Rice headquarters and really gave the central government's imprimatur to this project that's going on, this experiment in Wasteland. All land in China is owned by the state. So whether you're living in Beijing or living in the countryside, the land that your house stands on is owned by the state. A big difference in cities, though, is that you own your house. Those houses are sort of like mutual funds now. You can invest in the property market. You can use it as a collateral to get other loans. You can flip it for higher profit. Farmers don't have that luxury because their homes are, only cost about $1,500 to manufacture. They have no credit. They have no collateral to get loans. And so in the countryside, you're given a 30-year lease on your land, on your plot, your acre of land. And that's really all you have. You have your housing site and you have that. And if the village government starts saying to you, well, all the other villagers are signing their land over to the company, why aren't you doing it too? This is a collective village. You're supposed to move with the collective. It's really not your private property, is it? And so this is a tension in the village. And there's a whole half of the older farmers who don't want to sign their land or contract their land over to the company versus those who do. The way this works with Eastern Fortune Rice, here they are, this is the new tall billboard they put up in the village. It says, build the first village of the Northeast. What they're doing is saying, okay, right now, let's say you're making $2,300 a year on your rice crop. Here's what we'll do. You keep the 30-year rights on that plot of land, but we'll contract from you right now 3 years worth of crops. So right now you're making $2,200 a season on your rice. We'll give you right now, guaranteed price, $2,500, $2,600. You don't have to do a thing. Just sign the contract. You don't have to weed, you don't have to plant, you don't have to harvest, nothing. We'll take care of that with machines and with hired laborers. Again, half the village, I'd say, really likes this idea. Other half says, no, the price of rice is so high, we want to keep our traditions going as it is. So that's the big tension in the book of what's going on the farm right now. And this is the 12th year in a row that for Chinese New Year last week, the central government puts out a document, the most important policy of the year. 12th year in a row is about rural reforms. For about the 9th year in a row, it was praising places like Wasteland, saying the way to go is scale farming, the way America went in the 1930s and 40s. This is the transition we want to make. So I'm going to show you a couple pictures historically, though. One thing I thought was fascinating about these changes in the village is that they're taking place in an area of China that has long been the site of failed experiments. Manchuria has long been a geopolitical hotspot for the last 400 years, where different regimes came and went and tried different forms of government, tried utopian societies, tried different forms of economic systems. And It's an interesting place to travel because when you're in the south, you have to queue for a train ticket, you have to get in crowded train cars. When I would often travel in the Northeast, I'd have an entire train compartment to myself. A lot of the historic sites I was visiting are not Han Chinese historic sites, they're ethnic historic sites, they're Manchu, the Manchu nationality, their historic sites. Usually when you go to historic sites in China, there's an entrance gate, somebody's selling socks, somebody's selling postcards, and you go in. But in the Northeast, I would come to places like this. This is the sign, the only sign marking the Great Jin Dynasty, which was the first dynasty that originated in Manchuria, crossed the Great Wall, set up camp in Beijing, and those central lakes in Beijing, if you've been to Beijing, they date from these people. Genghis Khan overthrew them. But this is the relic. You go into this old imperial capital site and you just see this marker. There's no ticket window, there's nothing there. And so I started, after a while, really relishing the chance to travel. I ended up covering about 25,000 miles around this region of unearthing the history here and what's come and gone and how these great dreams and ambitions have all faded away. The Jin Dynasty was founded by this man, Wan Yanagura. This is his only statue I could find of him or representation in the entire Northeast. Again, no fence around him, no ticket window, nothing. The name Manchu comes thanks to this man. This is Nurhat-Se. He was the father of the Jurchen tribes that ruled the Northeast. He organized his people all together. His son redubbed them the Manchu, and the land they come from is the Manchu land. And it was his son who finally swept through the Great Wall and conquered Beijing. And the Qing Dynasty, which the Manchus ruled, had China from 1644 to 1912. So when you think back to that map I showed at the beginning, China as a chicken, most of that territory, those outer territories, were all added under Manchu rule. Xinjiang, Tibet, Taiwan, the Northeast, Inner Mongolia, and at the time, Outer Mongolia. There's 6,800 languages in the world, and they think half of those are going extinct by the end of this century, but none were once as powerful and prominent as Manchu. In the book, I visit this dead-end village out in the middle of nowhere where only 3 native Manchu speakers exist. So at one point, the Great Qing Dynasty, Manchu was the official language of the court. There's 10 million documents from that dynasty in the imperial archives in Beijing. A good 20% of those are only in Manchu, so they're unintelligible to researchers now. This is one of the 3 survivors who still speak the language fluently. In this village, I went to the elementary school, and this sort of made me smile, sadly in a way. This is Manchu here. This is what it looks like when it's written. It sounds sort of like a sibilant Korean when it's spoken. The Chinese underneath it says, "Passing on Manchu culture begins with me." And here I am in this dead-end village that oftentimes I meet people who are ethnically Manchu, and I wouldn't even know they were Manchu unless they told me. They so immersed themselves or intermingled with Han Chinese over the centuries that a lot of people, you can't tell if they're Manchu or not, nor that they speak the language. In this village, there is a teacher, a 39-year-old teacher, who's attempting to teach Manchu, this is outside his classroom, to children in the village. And he says, "This is my duty, my grandmother taught me, if I don't do this, who will?" And he has caught nothing but political problems since he started this, because in China, the language you learn in school is Mandarin, and the foreign language you learn is English. You can't learn Manchu as a foreign language. And so Manchuria is not different in this regard than Xinjiang or Tibet. These are the border regions of China where the native ethnic population wants to learn their native language, but it's been superseded by English even. The history of Manchuria it's one of populations ebbing and flowing, and the Manchu who came south of the Great Wall and conquered all of China for 300 years tried to keep Han Chinese from going over the Great Wall and into their territory. They always wanted to keep the Northeast as a sort of reserve. But then there was as many policies permitting migration to the north as there was forbidding it, because whenever the South would have a terrible famine, the emperor at the time would say, "Okay, we'll go to the north and plant those fields." Or whenever Russians started making incursions on the Songhua River and it started to come into the territory of the Northeast, the emperor would say, "Okay, Han Chinese, go ahead, go up to the north." But the Manchus did try to protect one central core area. It's about the size of the state of Maine in this region. And they tented it almost. They built something that's the Lesser Great Wall. It's called the Willow Palisade. And it was a moat. Here is the bed of that moat. And it was a large berm. Here's these wild sunflowers growing on that berm. And it was topped by trees that were lashed together with rope. Wasteland, the village I'm in, was within that excluded zone of where only Manchu could live inside. But again, this is all but eroded. And it was interesting talking to my wife about this. In school, she never learned anything about Manchu culture because the Manchu were the Qing dynasty, and that was the dynasty in which foreigners came in and invaded China, and China became weak. So that you would learn nothing about places like the Willow Palisade. Nor did my students today get taught this in their school books. They're only taught about the Great Wall. Here's some farmers gleefully jumping on some remains we found of the wall, or the Lesser Great Wall. The other thing I think is interesting about this region is after the Manchu influence started dimming, first Russia and then Japan moved into the region. And Russia had very strong designs for the Northeast, in part because they wanted a shortcut to connect Moscow and Vladivostok on their new Trans-Siberian Railroad. So in 1901, they started building, this is St. Sophia's Orthodox Cathedral in Harbin, one of the cities in the Great Northeast. Up until the 90s, when I first visited Harbin, you couldn't see this from the street. You didn't know it was there because it was shrouded by apartment buildings, and even the cathedral itself had been turned into a warehouse for a department store. When China started closing state-owned enterprises in the late 1990s, the Northeast was hit particularly hard. It was called the Rust Belt for about a decade there. And regional governments had to think of ways to raise revenues for their social services. And the way the Northeast cities did it was they dusted off these old imperial relics. You can't see sites like this elsewhere in China. They were pulled down during the Cultural Revolution or afterward. And one thing I loved about traveling in the Northeast, and I write about this a lot, it's sort of like traveling across a board game called Empire, right? And there's all these playing pieces that have been left behind. So you see the Orthodox Cathedral, which is now a patriotic education base. You see the old Russian-built railway stations out in the middle of nowhere, even when trains don't stop there anymore. The more desolate the surrounding area, the brighter the station walls were, which I like. It was almost like urging you to get off the train. Again, there's a plaque here showing this as a patriotic education base. These things remind visitors of the colonizing times in Russia, in the Northeast. You see these old Russian water towers, like the kind that Chekhov described in the cherry orchard. Here's a Soviet kind of building next to it up in the north. So those pieces still exist. And then you also see the next regime that came in. Japan defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905. Teddy Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize for brokering the ceasefire. This is a Japanese-built museum in Port Arthur, which is in the southern tip of historic Manchuria. And this is still standing. This is pea gravel here. It looks like a Habsburg palace almost, or something from Vienna. But in the book, I talked to the curator of this museum, a man who has worked there since the 1960s, asking him, how did you protect this from Red Guards during the Cultural Revolution? What purpose does this museum serve? And he's a patriot. He always says, I'm a patriot, I'm a patriot, I'm a patriot. But he said in the Northeast, being a patriot means examining all of its history. The whole point of the Northeast is that it's not like the rest of China. You have to admit that the Russians were here. You have to admit that the Japanese were here and shaped this region as well by building railroads, by building coal mines, by building factories, and so forth. This is also in Port Arthur. This is a Japanese hotel that they built for their railroad, the South Manchurian Railroad. You can still stay in these hotels throughout the region. Some of them have actually been renovated quite beautifully. But this one I like. This is 1912, and here's the same building 100 years later, still standing. So about all you can really recognize is the archway here. There's still that arch. But I do like that in 1912 the road was under construction, and 100 years later the road is still under construction. That's very Chinese. Like, you can add the GDP by tearing up a road and add the GDP by building a road. But this was actually the hotel where Puyi, the last emperor of China, who abdicated in 1912, was hidden by the Japanese en route to take the throne of Manchukuo, the puppet state. And so I went inside here I found his room, but there's no plaque marking the spot there. It's really derelict inside. But still, all the original wooden floors, the same window panes, everything inside. It's really eerie walking around in here. And then you see sites like this, which is incredible. I think we know about the rape of Nanking, we know about the Japanese occupation of all of China, but that happened in 1937, and of course Pearl Harbor was 1941. But in 1931, 6 years before the invasion of China proper, Japan invaded the Northeast. And to this day, the anniversary of that date is September 18th. And now in the Northeast, on September 18th, all traffic stops, schools stop, air raid sirens blow, and that moment is commemorated. When I first moved to this region, or first traveled this region a decade ago, traffic stopped for the start of the Korean War. That was the Memorial Day, that we memorialized the start of the Resist America, Aid Korea War. Well, now South Korea is an important ally of China, so that memorial is out the door, and now people stop and memorialize the day that Japan invaded Manchuria. This is an old Shinto temple in Changchun City that still stands. I was asking, these Japanese pines are still here. I was asking, why is this here? And somebody told me it's because the roller skaters love it. Here's a speed skating rollerblade team that's practicing out in front of it. But in Changchun, you still see examples of Japanese occupation. Japan called this style of architecture Rising Asia, and they built these buildings which they thought were going to last forever. This was the state council building for the puppet state of Manchukuo. Now it's used as a campus, hospital campus. This was the office of Puyi, the last emperor who I mentioned earlier, who thought he was going to be crowned by Japan as the emperor of the Manchu people. Instead, he was made chief executive of this puppet state called Manchukuo. Everything historically with Puyi in China now is affixed with puppet. He was the puppet emperor. And this is his puppet emperor's palace, where he lived under Japanese dominion. And when you walk inside that, you see a puppet Puyi. Here he is, gleefully conferring with a Japanese general, walking through this. And in the book, I follow his sad arc too. He's really sang to save the skin of the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal and was not punished for any of his actions during the war. The Chinese eventually re-educated him. A brief word on Manchukuo, and the reasons that China and Japan relations are still quite fraught. This is a propaganda poster from that area. This is the Manchukuo flag. This is the Japanese flag, and this is the Vichy Republic of China flag, and the notion again that these three races could all exist together. That's the straight narrative of Japanese relations with China and why things are tense, and I understand that. But in the Northeast, they're a bit more nuanced because of this campaign. See the Japanese flag here over the village? This says, "To Manchuria," and this was a recruitment poster in the Japanese home islands. Japanese farms in the late 1930s were suffering through a horrible depression. And the army came up with this notion, this plan called the Millions to Manchuria campaign, where they would take second and third generation children in farming villages. Leave the first generation there with mom and dad. But second sons, third sons, second son or daughters, third daughters would get on a ship, go to the northeast of China, found a farming village with the exact same name as the Japanese village back home and start farming. Now, the people who signed up for this thought they were getting 25 acres, they thought they were getting a mule. They thought they were getting land that they were going to open themselves. What they didn't know often is when they arrived there that they were living on land that had been forcibly taken from native Chinese, in some cases bayoneted to get them off the land. And in addition to their hoes, they were issued single bolt action rifles. And the men had been told that you're exempt from the draft. But after the United States finally had its air base that was within range of bombing the home islands, those men were called up in 1944 and 1945, leaving women and children on these farms. About 270,000 women and children were behind on these farms. And by summer 1945, when the Soviet army started heading towards Manchuria, a Japanese general in a secret cable said, of those women and children, their only alternative is suicide, and they were left behind. And one thing I think is interesting about the Northeast and this narrative it has with the war and with Japan that's still being written is I visit this site in the book. This is in the Songhua River, about 3 hours downstream from Harbin. This is where thousands of Japanese women and their children waited on these docks for what they told were rescue ships. The Japanese army was going to send transport ships to get them, which never came. As the Soviets got closer and closer, the women put their children on shore and stepped into the current. Many of those children were adopted by local Chinese farmers. And in fact, this man is a local Chinese historian here who's been campaigning for years to get this site marked as a historic spot. He says, Japanese civilians were also victims of Japanese imperialism. The war does not, we can't draw the difference that all Japanese were bad or all Japanese were good for this matter. So in this town, in the 1960s, Zhou Enlai, the then premier of China, actually dedicated a cemetery in this town in which the remains of these Japanese pioneer farmers, mostly women, were interred, as were the remains of the Chinese parents that adopted the Japanese children. And this is called the Sino-Japanese Friendship Garden. And it survived the Cultural Revolution, but it did not survive the internet. This is a couple of years ago. It's the only screen grab I could get. That's why it's fuzzy, before it was deleted off the Chinese websites. But this here says, the Japanese pioneer farmers, or Chinese you say exploitation regiments, but Japanese pioneer farmer memorial. And this is the names of 500 Japanese farmers whose bodies had recently been exhumed. And there's, people from Japan still come back and visit this town and pay respects for them. People from this village still go to Japan to work. I went to Tokyo and interviewed some of the orphans that went back to Japan for the first time in the 1970s. 1980s to live. They'd spent the 40s and 50s and 60s in China. Well, when this memorial went up 3 years ago, word spread on the internet. These gentlemen are from the south of China. They rode a train up and smashed the monument with a sledgehammer and daubed it with paint. Such an outcry was raised all over China that such a cemetery exists that this memorial was bulldozed the next day and the cemetery was locked. And so people in this county, they have this very fraught relationship now where they feel they're being called traitors by the rest of the nation, when in fact they're out in the middle of nowhere. And they say, we have a very different relationship with the war and with Japanese than, say, people in Nanjing or Shanghai or even Beijing for that matter. Now, there are reasons there's good reasons that people have suspicions about memorializing Japanese. This is the Unit 731 memorial. This was run by a Japanese doctor who was China's answer to Joseph Mengele. He performed live experiments on prisoners of war, and 3,000 Russians and Chinese and Mongolians and Manchu were killed here. They were exposed to chemical warfare and really grisly experimentation. It's a bit odd when you visit it because there's a middle school right here, so you hear children's laughter as you're walking past bone saws and these exhibits. But one thing I'm interested in the book, and I go into it in some detail, is how this doctor and his staff, when they went back to Japan, were given immunity by the American Army in exchange for their findings of their research. I go to the National Archives and find the memos of the Army asking for that immunity and why. And that was kept secret for a good 30 years until a journalist uncovered it. One other thing, that is still ongoing is this narrative of what happened at the end of the war. Now, in the run-up to the 2008 Olympics, this memorial went up. This was the old site of the Mukden Allied Prisoner of War Camp, World War II. And that was the only sign that was put up. This was a prisoner of war camp where the majority of Bataan Death March survivors were shipped. And also the general who surrendered Singapore, General Percival, Lieutenant General Percival, and the general that surrendered the Philippines, Lieutenant General Wainwright, they were also brought here and interred for a few years. And in the book, I interview the OSS agent who parachuted in to liberate them. He jumped out of an airplane, armed only with a pistol, and landed amongst 30,000 Japanese soldiers in August 1945 and had to convince them that the war was over and they should open the camp. He passed away last year. This is Harold Leith. He was a staff sergeant. I was happy to talk to him. But one of the ongoing narratives still is what do you do with museums like this in the Northeast? Is this an example of Japanese fascism? Is this an example of Chinese kindnesses shown to prisoners of war? How do you memorialize this as a patriotic education base or otherwise? And the American POW survivors and people like Harold Leith had long, contentious arguments with the Chinese about what plaque should be put up, what that narrative should be. And so that's the other thing I think is interesting. In China, you always hear 5,000 years of history, and this happened, and that happened, and everything leads to communist revolution and communist victory. But in this area, history is so much more recent, and there's so many parties involved in the telling of the history that it gets a lot more complicated. And that extends to the Korean War. I'm just going to show you a few more slides here, but this is the Yalu River, this is the China side, this is the North Korea side, this is the bridge. MacArthur was ordered by Omar Bradley, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and President Truman. You can only bomb the Korean side of the bridge. Don't provoke the Chinese. The Chinese didn't heed that warning, and they would have planes taking off constantly, shooting at American or U.S. Navy pilots that were trying to down this bridge. So this went on and on and on and on. 6-day battle. Here's the bridge today. The Korean side did, in fact, go down. This is North Korea, I like the Ferris wheel right here. But now it's a tourist attraction. Here's some unexploded ordnance. And the Chinese visitors, you can walk halfway across the bridge. But the plaque here just says, the Americans bombed the bridge November 8th to November 14th, 1950. They don't tell you this very dramatic story that was going on behind the scenes of MacArthur and Truman and Bradley going at it, and what Chairman Mao knew all the while, because he was massing 130,000 Chinese troops here, and by the time they dropped the bridge, after 600 sorties, the river froze 5 days later, and 100,000 Chinese troops just walked across the river, right? Including somebody in my village, who was then 16, who went into war. And so he's a character in the book too, as I'm talking about those experiences. In the cities of the Northeast, it was a manufacturing base, and it was this notion of the iron rice bowl. Communism, I think the patriotism, and especially love for Chairman Mao, was quite high when I first started traveling in this region in the late 1990s. Now that thought is sort of been tucked away in little museums like this. This is actually a museum in Shenyang to the manufacturing dorm rooms. This was called Workers' Village, and it was like a socialist paradise, and that they had heat, they had working telephones, they had flush toilets. This is where workers were moved into in the 1950s. It has since almost all been torn down, and so you only see vestiges of it in little museums like this. This, by the way, says, today, the first lesson, long live Chairman Mao, on the board. But it's really a museum for communism, which you don't see elsewhere in China, because communism is supposed to, the Communist Party is supposed to be in charge still, right? But they're memorializing this past era here in the Northeast. This is what Workers' Village looked like when it was originally built, these 3-story walk-ups with gardens in the middle. Again, for the 1950s, this was really advanced for China. But by the time I got there in the 2000s, it was being torn down. So this gentleman was a former factory worker who had lost his home and was now living outside and actually cooking his dinner here on the outside, still wearing his old Mao cap. You know, this is now, they kept the street names of this neighborhood, so you still see like Defend Industry Boulevard, but the apartments, the condos on it are Napa Grove, you know, Sausalito. It's really amazing, right?
Yeah.
So when you do see Chairman Mao or Mao's invoke, it's in places like this. This is the statue of Chairman Mao in Shenyang, and these are recently laid off state-owned enterprise workers who are actually prostrating to him. They're bowing to him. They're leaving flowers to him and praying for a new job from the state. Now in the village, I'll show you 3 more images here. Back in the wasteland, you know, this era seems so distant. This propaganda painted on this old unused granary building says, "Long live the Communist Party." This is a lot like seeing those rusting fallout shelter signs on American post offices, right? Like, you do still see things like study in agriculture, study Dajai. Dajai was the name of a commune in the early 1970s. You still see these things, but they're so far in the past already. The farmers often say that, well, we've spent more time dismantling a Marxist economy than we spent building one. And so instead in Wasteland, I'll show you 2 more pictures here. Now we see this. These are the new signs, right? The Eastern Fortune Rice, our local agribusiness, put up this archway. It's advertising itself. Here's its slogans. This is leading to a brand new hot spring resort that the company built right here, where city folk are coming out in their cars on the weekends to soak in the hot springs. Japanese style, by the way. They brag about that. They're Japanese. It's a Japanese design they copied. And they have an organic greenhouse where kids can pick strawberries and organic watermelons and sort of experience that nostalgia for a past they'll never know, which I think is interesting. And one last thing here. This is, you know, as the book was drawing to a close, you're always wondering, like, how do you end a book and how do you end years of research? And 2 things happened. One is my roommate, Mr. Guan, his family decided to sign their land over to Eastern Fortune Rice. So the irony here is that the house I lived in Beijing, this old historic house that I thought was going to be torn down, that Beijing house is still standing. My farmhouse in Wasteland has been destroyed because Mr. Guan and his family chose to move into the apartments, and they're quite happy doing that. And this is a shot of their very last rice harvest as a family. They harvested by hand and spread it on the road to dry, you know. And now the company takes care of that for them with machines, and it goes into a mechanic polisher and so forth. And the last thing that happened in the village, you know, that's still sort of playing out is the head of Eastern Fortune Rice was very forthcoming to me. I've been very lucky with my China reporting. I'm always honest. I'm there to write a book and so forth. And the company was always very welcoming and asked me, what do you want to know? And I did due diligence on them. I had a credit report run. I had lawyers look at lawsuits against them. It's a lot easier to do that sort of work in China now. But on one of my last days in the village, the head of the company asked me to come over to the hot spring of all places, but I never went to, because it just felt so odd walking in there with all these city tourists, and they would all stare at me like I was a kangaroo. But he sat me down and he said, you know, I got some news for you. I said, what? And he said, we're thinking of changing the village name. And I said, Wasteland's a beautiful name. Don't change that. It dates back to 1722. It's a fantastic name. And he said, no, I think we have a better idea. I said, what? He said, we want to change the name of the village to Eastern Fortune, after our company. And in my head I thought, oh my God, it's really become a company town. We're at that level right now. So I'll end there, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you. Anything. It doesn't have to be a rice or Manchuria. Yeah.
You mentioned that your books are being translated
Yeah.
into Chinese. Do you run into any political repercussions for what you've written, or have to adjust the translated versions in any way?
I've been really lucky in that I haven't, and it's been an odd journey. I like to think that maybe it's because I was a Peace Corps volunteer, and so whatever file I have, you know, if anybody opens it up to see who I was, because there is sort of a history. There's a couple of people who were in Peace Corps who do different kinds of reporting that other reporters aren't able to do in China. And the Beijing book was banned for the first 4 years. And I think what happened was, honestly, is that the problem of the Hutong has been solved. They're gone. So it's no longer sensitive to put a book out in Chinese about it because it's not such a pressing issue anymore. But the way it actually happened was I was teaching journalism at the University of Hong Kong, and one of my best students was a native Beijinger, and she translated the book without telling me. And she came to me at the end of class after the grades were in, and she said, I want you to know as a native Beijinger, I really like this book, and I want to get this published in Chinese. And she's the one that went around to publishing houses. I gave her a very nice finder's fee for this. But she came back to me and said, you know what? Don't let a Beijing publisher do it. Go with a Shanghai publisher. Because the Shanghai publisher is going to try to circumvent things anyway. And so a 400-page book, only 3 sentences were cut from the book. And I thought they were very interesting choices. One is they let me keep in my interview with Ai Weiwei, who co-designed the Bird's Nest Stadium. They let me keep in there his father's persecution in the Cultural Revolution, that Ai Weiwei would not set foot in the Bird's Nest Stadium. But Ai Weiwei used a curse word in describing Beijing, so they cut that, because that was vulgar. They cut a sentence where I alluded to a vice mayor sitting down at a planning meeting with his teenage mistress, who was sucking noisily on a lollipop. I mean, it was really a caricature, pigtails, the whole thing, right? And they said, no, we can't have a Communist Party member would never do something like that, right? But the thing that really annoyed me, and this is going to be an issue with the Manchuria book, is they cut, every neighborhood in Beijing has a gazetteer. So if you're a new official in that neighborhood, they give you a local history book showing you what had happened, so key points in the neighborhood's development. And our local gazetteer, which the people gave me, the officials gave me to use as research, they have the entries for June 3rd, 1989, June 4th, 1989, June 5th, 1989. So we're right next to Tiananmen Square. And so I put that in the book. And when Matt got to it, they said, absolutely not. We can't have any mention of June 4th. And I said, okay, what if we say 3 days after June 1st? And they said, no, the computers will catch that too. Like any with June or 89, right? And so when I did the book tour, my translator had made a stack of photocopies of that page of the gazetteer in Chinese. And when we sat down with Chinese journalists in every city, she'd start by saying, this is what was cut from the book. And she'd hand that out. And journalists would say, oh yeah, we know. It's amazing because journalists, you can go on Google Books and read it. You can look at the Taiwan edition and read it. You can look, there's websites that show comparisons of Western books and what comes out in the mainland. In other words, there's more holes in the system than we're led to believe. The Manchuria book's going to be tougher with the translation. I'm going through it right now because there's an event. They say the Northeast fell without a single shot, that the communists defeated the KMT without firing a single shot in this enormous battle, the Battle of Changchun, which is called the Siege of Changchun, which is what was the capital of Manchukuo. What happened in that siege was Lin Biao, the communist general who went on to produce Mao's Little Red Book, simply surrounded the city with barbed wire. And he said, we'll starve them out. We'll starve all the troops out, all the KMT troops, and we'll starve any civilians out. And I found there are communist generals' diaries and books that were written from that time of it's becoming difficult to explain to the troops why we're turning back civilians from leaving the city. It's becoming difficult to tell troops to fire on civilians. So 160,000 people died in the siege, which is equivalent. The Chinese general said something like, that's how many died in Hiroshima. Hiroshima took 5 seconds, Changchun took 5 months. And so that's in the book. I described the siege, because you still meet survivors of the siege. When you go to Changchun, you meet elderly people. And I'm really worried if they say we're going to cut that, I have to say then you can't do the book. Because it's a really important part of how the area changed. Yeah?
What was the Japanese strategy for winning the war with the Chinese?
So the idea in Manchuria was, some people observing at the time was like, it was the first blitzkrieg warfare, this idea of just overrun them simply, right? And yeah, and sheer numbers too, but also a lot of aerial bombardment. That's right. There was a huge battle called the Battle of Nomonhan up on the border with the Soviet army, where the guy who ended up liberating Stalingrad in the Battle of Berlin, Zhukov, faced off. He was on cavalry at that time and was facing off Japanese generals, and all of a sudden that accelerated into warplanes, and it was the first sort of aerial fighting in World War II at that battle. So Japan overran Manchuria quite quickly without any resistance from the Chinese, and in the book I talk about why that was, that really the Chinese army felt like it. I think the quote from Zhang Shuiliang, the young marshal, was, we could only have made a shambolic go of it, which I like. Said it would have been futile to resist them, it was so powerful. So they used Manchukuo as a base over the Great Wall. They negotiated a ceasefire. The League of Nations failed to kick Japan out. One of the reasons the League of Nations failed. And they used it as a manufacturing base and really a resource base. So a lot of coal, iron, grain was being shipped from Manchuria back to the home islands because of the embargoes that were against Japan elsewhere. So it was fueling their industry. And then from there they spread south and invaded Beijing and then the rest of China. And so eventually it was going to be part of the East Asian co-prosperity sphere, the empire stretching all the way to Singapore, Taiwan, and so forth, but it didn't work. Yeah.
So the company Eastern Fortune
Yeah.
Rice, that's so dominant there.
Yeah.
Is that a state-owned business or what kind of, how does that work?
No, it's a good question. There's all these quasi sort of state-backed, state-owned, state-partnered. In agribusiness, Cargill, a big Minnesota-based, one of the largest agribusiness companies in the world, is doing this in China. They're sewing together farms as well. Cargill has something called Site 82, which I think sounds kind of evil, but it's in the province where Pearl Buck wrote The Good Earth, Anhui. And they, right now, process 65 million chickens a year. It's an enormous farm. And they employ 4,000 locals as well. But the Chinese government likes them because they have uniform antibiotics and fertilizer and all that. So there's that. And then there's wholly private farms that are going in. Like next to Wasteland, a Singapore company is starting a 500 square mile super farm, the size of a metropolitan Los Angeles. They're going to do poultry and pig and organic farming. So that's pretty private as well. And then Eastern Fortune is on paper private, but because of this rural area and the way they're contracting the land, they have to have government support. And the way they do that is one of the people on the board of Eastern Fortune Rice conveniently became the village official. So he's got the documents that can sign over the contracts for the land as well. So I haven't seen any direct investment, looking at names on who's on the charter and so forth, if they're connected to the province level and stuff. But I think we could safely say that if not village officials for sure, I'm sure provincial officials as well have a hand in this business and want to see it succeed. Yeah. But technically, it's a private startup. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
So the people have a 30-year lease on the land, and then they sell it to.
Well, they lease it. They lease a 3-year term of it, right?
What happens at the end of their 30-year lease?
Well, officially, it'll just be renewed. We've gone from these leases started in 1979 as a grassroots revolt. It was very similar to the Pilgrims landing actually at Plymouth Rock and trying communal farming and failing at it, and then switching to private plots 2 winters later. The same thing in China happened in the late 70s where farmers said we're starving, this is off, we can't do this mandatory grain procurement anymore, we want to raise our own crops secretly. And there's a big museum to this in the countryside now where these farmers signed a pact, with their thumbprints at night and started this private farming. That turned into 15-year leases in the 80s, that turned into 30-year leases in the 90s. And so in theory, when your 30 years are up, which hasn't happened yet because these leases haven't run out 30 years yet, you would just have that lease renewed. So it's weird, there's only a finite level of supply of land. So if you imagine all of us in the village right now, and we have the size of this parking lot, once I die, who gets my plot of land? Do you divide a little sliver of it and give each of us a tenth of that plot? What happens when one of you have a child? Isn't she or he going to get a plot of that land? So that land, those rights and those are always shifting. And then there's always different strips of land, if you want to develop that old canal, that drainage ditch into fertile land, go for it. But now who owns that? So it's really funny when you go to the village office. There's they don't have any gazetteers. They have no history left. They burned those for fuel in the 1970s, unfortunately, so that didn't matter. But they do have these enormous ledger books of these land contracts, and the land is always shifting. Who goes what? And now, of course, Eastern Fortune takes advantage of this and I don't want to paint them as evil. I think they're an antagonist for some people because they have a lot of clout behind them. But they take advantage of this by saying, we'll lease. Oh, you're going to lease your plot? And I can go to your neighbor and say, well, he did it. Why don't? It'd be a lot easier if our harvesters could cut through your land. They coerce them that way. It's not eminent domain yet. Yeah, it's still voluntary. Yes.
What's the structure of government, and how are decisions made locally and then as you go on up nationally?
Officially, it's collective. Everything's collective in the countryside. So what that means in a place like Wasteland is there's 1,500 people. Like I said, there's 1,000 adults. There's a village committee. There's a little police station. The village committee in this place is 5 people. 1 has been elected, 4 have been appointed. The 1 who's been elected is really the only person that runs. It's a hand-picked slate. It's not like I can come in there and say, I want to stand for village committee, right? there's nothing happening at that local level where they're going to say like, let's privatize the land, because it's a constitutional amendment, you can't do that. So I don't want to say they're powerless, but they take orders from Jilin City. Jilin City takes orders from Jilin Province. Provinces have more autonomy than ever before. So I don't think a lot of orders are coming from Beijing, definitely from the province. But when there's legal disputes, people do go to Beijing. So I do follow a farmer who sues the local individual, Sanjo, the gentleman I showed you, doesn't want to give his farm up. He actually sued the local committee government because he felt his land lease wasn't being honored, and so he took that matter all the way to Beijing. He petitioned outside of the government office. The government office agreed with him. He came back to Jilin, went through the Jilin City Court. The Jilin City Court told the village, leave this guy alone, he's fine. Right? So there's dispute processes, resolution processes that are in place now that didn't exist even 10 years ago. And I've never seen more law books in China than in farmers' homes. Really. And there's radio call-in shows that are popular weekly. There are farmer newspapers that are all about law issues. People are really adamant about, people are now using GPS to measure their land allotment, not just walking it anymore. You know, like, people are very aware of their rights. And it's funny, farmers there would often ask me, like, what's the biggest difference between American farmers and Chinese farmers? And I'd always want to say, like, the farm bill or crop insurance or subsidies. And my wife, who's a lawyer, would be kicking me under the table saying, tell them it's due process. Tell them due process. You know, like, tell them that's important and they should be fighting for their rights, you know, at every turn.
Do they have trial by jury?
No, not in land dispute issues. No, it's adjudicated by a referee.
Any other issues?
No, actually, I've never seen a jury in China. No. Yeah, a magistrate decides. I never thought of it before until you brought that up. That there aren't juries there. That's right.
But we need to get to signing.
Okay, last question. Yes.
What's the translation for wasteland?
Huangdi.
What?
Huangdi. Not emperor, but just empty land. There's a Da Huangdi and a Xiao Huangdi. I lived in Xiao Huangdi.
And what will be the translation for the new name for wasteland?
Dongfu. It'll be the Eastern Fortune. Yeah, Dongfu Cun. Yeah, that's it. All right, I'll stop there. Thanks so much for coming.